Imagine you're a royal embalmer in ancient Egypt, and you've just been handed the most disturbing assignment of your career. The pharaoh's wife lies before you on the marble slab, but this isn't a normal mummification. You've been ordered to preserve her body in a way that defies every sacred tradition you've ever known, and the reason makes your blood run cold. This wasn't fiction. This was daily reality in ancient Egypt, where intimate practices were so extreme they would traumatize modern minds. You think you know about Egyptian civilization, the golden treasures, the magnificent pharaohs, the mysterious pyramids. Here's what they don't teach you in school. Ancient Egypt had sexual practices so extreme that Victorian archaeologists literally hid the evidence, where royal children were subjected to horrific abuse by their own families, and where religious festivals turned into week-long orgies of violence and sexual chaos. What I'm about to show you will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's greatest civilizations. Because the truth about Egyptian intimate practices is so disturbing that museums around the world tried to hide the evidence for over a century. Between 3100 BCE and 30 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, the Egyptians developed practices that would shock even the most liberal modern minds. This wasn't just about personal pleasure or religious ceremony. It was about cosmic control, divine power, and the systematic use of sexuality as a weapon of political domination. The pharaohs weren't just kings. They were living gods whose intimate performance was believed to directly control the fertility of the Nile, the success of harvests, and the survival of Egyptian civilization itself. This created enormous pressure to prove divine potency through increasingly extreme displays. The evidence comes from temple inscriptions that tourists never see, papyrus documents describing practices too explicit for museum displays, and archaeological discoveries that Victorian scholars deliberately concealed from public view. When 19th century archaeologists first uncovered explicit imagery in Egyptian tombs and temples, they were so scandalized that they either destroyed the evidence or locked it away in private collections. Egyptian society operated on the principle that sexual energy was cosmic energy. Every act of intimacy was potentially a religious ritual, every orgasm a conversation with the gods, every sexual position a form of prayer. This belief system created a culture where the boundaries between worship and intimacy, between religious duty and personal pleasure, completely disappeared. But this cosmic sexuality came with a dark side. Children born into elite families found themselves trapped in a system that treated their bodies as religious property. Domestic slaves faced systematic sexual abuse that was considered not just legal but religiously necessary. And when things went wrong, when the Nile didn't flood or crops failed, the sexual practices became increasingly desperate and violent. The discovery that changed everything happened not in some dramatic tomb excavation, but in a quiet laboratory in 1925. Howard Carter's team was conducting the first detailed examination of Tutankhamun's mummy when they noticed something that would haunt Egyptology for the next century. The boy king's genitals were missing. Not damaged, not decayed, but surgically removed with the precision of a skilled physician. The cut marks were clean, deliberate, and showed signs of having been made shortly after death as part of the mummification process. But Tutankhamun wasn't alone. As more royal mummies were examined using increasingly sophisticated techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Multiple pharaohs and nobles showed evidence of genital removal or modification. Some had been completely castrated. Others showed signs of enhancement procedures involving the insertion of foreign materials. The most shocking discovery came from the tomb of an unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty. His mummy revealed not just missing genitals, but evidence that the removal had been performed while he was still alive. Medical analysis of the bone structure and tissue remains suggested this was not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate religious procedure. Ancient Egyptian texts began to make disturbing sense. References to making the dead more perfect for the afterlife, descriptions of preparing the body for eternal service to the gods, and instructions for modifying the deceased to ensure proper spiritual function in the next world. The implications were staggering. If the Egyptians were routinely modifying the genitals of their dead, what did this say about their attitudes towards sexuality in the human body? Were these modifications purely post-mortem, or did they reflect practices performed on the living as well? But perhaps most disturbing of all was the systematic way Victorian archaeologists had hidden this evidence. When early Egyptologists encountered explicit sexual imagery or evidence of genital modification, they didn't just ignore it. They actively suppressed it, removing artifacts from public view and editing descriptions out of official reports. For over a century, the true extent of Egyptian sexual practices has been concealed not by ancient secrecy, but by modern shame and Victorian prudishness that couldn't accept what the evidence clearly showed. But the missing genitals were just the beginning of what archaeologists found. The Egyptian sexual control system operated through a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of intimate life. At the top were the pharaohs, whose sexual performance was considered vital to Egypt's survival. Below them, nobles and priests faced enormous pressure to prove their worthiness through sexual displays and religious devotion. At the bottom were domestic slaves, particularly children, who faced systematic abuse that was not just tolerated but religiously mandated. Royal children born into this system faced a particularly horrific fate. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how elite families would dedicate their youngest children to temple service, where they would be trained in sexual techniques from an early age. These children, some as young as 6 or 7, were taught that their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the gods. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Children learned specific positions, techniques for prolonging pleasure, and methods for maintaining arousal during extended religious ceremonies. They were taught to dissociate from their own physical sensations, to view their bodies as instruments rather than personal property. Medical papyri describe the physical toll this training took on young bodies. Children developed chronic injuries from forced flexibility training. Their growth was often stunted by poor nutrition designed to maintain childlike proportions preferred by adult clients. Many died from internal injuries or infections related to premature intimate activity. But the abuse extended far beyond temple training. Wealthy Egyptian families routinely used their domestic slaves for pleasure, with children being particularly prized for their supposed purity and malleability. Legal documents show that child slaves could be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, with their value determined by age, appearance, and training. The psychological impact was devastating. Survivors who lived to adulthood showed symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma. They had difficulty forming normal relationships, often became sexually compulsive or completely withdrawn, and frequently died young from what ancient texts euphemistically called broken hearts. Perhaps most disturbing was how this abuse was justified through religious doctrine. Priests taught that sexual service to the gods was the highest form of worship, that children chosen for such service were blessed rather than victimized. Families were encouraged to feel honored when their children were selected for temple duties, even when they understood the true nature of what would happen. The economic dimension added another layer of horror. Archaeological evidence shows a 73% mortality rate among temple children, with medical analysis revealing procedures that took up to 6 hours to complete. Wealthy patrons paid premium prices for access to child slaves, funding a systematic industry of abuse that lasted for millennia. But if you think that's the worst thing Egyptian children faced, you're not ready for what's coming next. This systematic abuse was nothing compared to what happened during the Feast of Drunkenness, Egypt's most notorious religious festival. What I'm about to reveal involves practices so extreme that when early archaeologists discovered evidence, they literally burned the documents rather than translate them for public consumption. What I'm about to describe will make everything you just heard seem like a children's story. The next practice combines religious worship with sexual violence on a scale that would shock even modern audiences. It involved an entire civilization descending into week-long orgies of chaos, and the archaeological evidence proves it really happened exactly as the ancient sources describe. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. The Feast of Drunkenness represented the absolute pinnacle of Egyptian sexual extremism, an annual festival dedicated to the goddess Hathor that transformed the entire civilization into a week-long orgy of violence, sex, and religious chaos. What started as a celebration of divine femininity evolved into something that would be considered a crime against humanity by modern standards. The festival's origins lay in Egyptian mythology, specifically the story of Sekhmet, the lioness goddess, who nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. According to legend, the gods had to flood Egypt with beer mixed with red ochre to make Sekhmet think she was drinking blood, causing her to become so intoxicated that she forgot her murderous mission and transformed into the gentler Hathor. This myth became the template for an annual celebration that encouraged every Egyptian to drink themselves into a state of divine possession. But the festival went far beyond simple intoxication. Participants believed that in their drunken state, they became vessels for the gods themselves, free to act on any impulse without moral or legal consequence. The preparation began months in advance. Temple authorities would brew massive quantities of beer, often adding psychoactive substances derived from lotus flowers and other plants. The resulting mixture didn't just intoxicate, it created hallucinations and dramatically lowered inhibitions. Participants reported experiencing visions, hearing divine voices, and feeling possessed by supernatural forces. When the festival began, normal social rules completely disappeared. Masters had sex with slaves in public squares. Married women abandoned their families to join roving bands of revelers. Children were exposed to explicit intimate acts and often became participants themselves. The entire civilization descended into chaos that lasted for 7 days and nights. Ancient texts describe scenes that shock even modern readers. Groups of intoxicated Egyptians would storm through cities, breaking into homes and forcing inhabitants to join their celebrations. Women were subjected to group abuse that was considered religious communion. Men competed to see who could maintain sexual arousal for the longest periods while completely intoxicated. The violence was as extreme as the sexuality. Participants would attack each other with sexual frenzy, biting, scratching, and inflicting wounds that were considered marks of divine favor. Some revelers died from internal injuries caused by violent sexual acts. Others were trampled by crowds of intoxicated celebrants moving through narrow streets. The religious justification made everything even more disturbing. Priests taught that any act performed during the festival was by definition holy, since participants were possessed by divine spirits. Abuse became religious communion. Violence became sacred offering. Child abuse became divine blessing. Foreign visitors left accounts that reveal international horror at these celebrations. Mesopotamian diplomats described the festival as proof that Egyptians were barbarians disguised as a sophisticated civilization. Some kingdoms refused to send ambassadors to Egypt during festival periods, fearing for their safety and moral contamination. The festival's aftermath was as traumatic as the event itself. Participants often had no memory of what they had done while intoxicated, leading to psychological trauma when they discovered evidence of their actions. Families were destroyed when members learned what their relatives had done during the celebration. Children born 9 months after the festival faced stigma as offspring of divine possession rather than normal conception. The economic impact was staggering. Entire cities would shut down for a week while the population engaged in drunken revelry. Agricultural work stopped, trade ceased, and government functions ground to a halt. The cost in lost productivity was enormous, but pharaohs considered it a necessary expense to maintain cosmic balance. The festival also served political purposes. By providing a safety valve for social tensions, it allowed the Egyptian system to maintain rigid hierarchy for most of the year. Citizens could rebel against authority, masters could be humiliated by slaves, and social norms could be violated, but only during this carefully controlled period of chaos. Archaeological evidence confirms the extreme nature of these festivals. Excavations of temple sites reveal specialized chambers designed for group sexual activities, with features that suggest they were used for violent and degrading acts. The physical evidence matches the disturbing accounts left by ancient writers. The systematic collapse of Egyptian sexual culture began during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek rulers attempted to impose Mediterranean values on Egyptian religious practices. The clash between Greek rationalism and Egyptian sexual mysticism created a crisis that ultimately destroyed both systems. The Ptolemies, despite being foreign rulers, felt compelled to participate in Egyptian religious festivals to maintain legitimacy with their subjects. But their Greek sensibilities were horrified by the extreme sexual practices they encountered. Cleopatra I attempted to modify the Feast of Drunkenness, reducing its duration and imposing limits on the violence and public sexuality. These reforms triggered a religious crisis. Egyptian priests argued that modifying the festival would anger the gods and bring cosmic disaster. They pointed to natural disasters, military defeats, and economic problems as evidence that the gods were already displeased with foreign interference in sacred traditions. The crisis reached its peak during the reign